Do you sometimes wonder how you could truly have an impact when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? How do you know you are moving in the right direction when it comes to becoming a more inclusive individual? As Diverse as Two Peas in a Pod brings topics such as ethnicity, genders, sexuality, or religion on the table. We talk about research and science, but also emotions, feelings, and vulnerability. We discuss allyship, advocacy, and privilege. But most importantly, we talk action. Because without action, we stay still. And when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, stillness is never the answer. Welcome to As Diverse as Two Peas in a Pod. Jennifer is the talent management head for UK and Ireland at Tata Consultancy Services. She focuses on driving the talent agenda to develop leaders and create a more diverse and inclusive workplace. She works in close partnership with business leaders, diverse talent groups, clients, and the community. In her early career, Jennifer has worked in several different roles, including employee engagement, internal communications, and corporate sustainability. She has led the development of one of the executive women's leadership programs for TCS globally. Before joining TCS in 2008, she worked as a research assistant at the Institute of Media and Communications at the University of Augsburg in Germany. Jennifer is from Germany and she has lived and worked across US, Australia, India, and UK. She is a qualified leadership coach from the Academy of Executive Coaching, and she holds a master's degree in Organisational Social Psychology from London School of Economics, as well as a Bachelor Degree in Media and Communications. She is happily married, proud mother of a young daughter, and loves traveling and marathon running. In today's episode, Jennifer and I dive into the topic of diversity with a cultural lens, and how each and every one of us can cultivate a culturally conscious mindset in the workplace. Jenny, welcome so much to this episode of As Diverse as Two Peas in a Pod, our podcast on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Just to introduce yourself, I want to ask you, what's your story?
Thank you, Julian. Well, it's wonderful to be part of the podcast. What's my story? I would always say I identify myself as a German American living in the UK and married across culture to an Indian man. I'm a mother of a 4.5-year-old daughter. I'm passionate about inclusion and diversity, and I'm a marathon runner.
Amazing. Thanks for sharing all that. So you started mentioning a little bit about you being in between two different cultures, even maybe a few more actually, but heavily between maybe a more Western culture and an Eastern culture. How's that like?
Yeah, I think it's been something, so kind of, I guess, living and working across culture has been a key part of my life. As I kind of was mentioning, I'm originally from Germany, but kind of was raised in the US, lived there for about 10 years. And then I studied and lived across Australia, Germany, India for some time, and now in the UK. So I've always been interested and fascinated about different cultures, different ways of looking at things, different ways of living. And I joined in 2008 a company called Tata Consultancy Services. And their headquarters in India. So an Indian heritage company, an incredible company, now working across 46 different countries with 500,000 employees. So a global organization with a very strong Indian heritage. So early on, I realized that there are differences in the way we work, in the way we engage, in the way we connect at work. It's been, for me at least, it's been a fascinating experience. because I believe, we're sometimes like, if you think about culture, we're like fish in water. You don't really think about the water around you because it's just there. It's something you need, but it's around you. So only when you really step out of your own culture, you also more deeply understand your own culture and how you've been influenced in your ways of thinking. So that was my early experience when, with 10 years old, I moved from Germany to the US and, could barely speak English, had to kind of adapt to very different ways of being. And so similar when I stepped into the Tata organization at that time, I was like, oh, they're working slightly differently. And it's just fascinating because I think it enables me so much more to appreciate and leverage different ways of being and working. Yeah, for me personally, I love it. And I think it's such a benefit.
So I want to dig deeper a little bit on the work side. But before I do so, I want to ask you another question. So we talk often about the diversity and the inclusion within the organization, or at an organizational level at least, having a number of benefits. And that's probably a lot of the things we read about on the internet. If you look for any of these keywords, they talk about what's the benefit for an organization to be more diverse and inclusive. We don't always talk too much about what's the impact as an individual. I'd love to hear in your experience, what are the kind of the skills that you have developed by being in a more diverse environment, being more inclusive as an individual as well? How has that helped you?
Great question. Yeah. I think when you step into an environment where you just feel safe, where you feel you can voice your opinions, you can share your perspectives, you feel those are valued, those are heard, you just bring everything out that you have. So in some ways, if that environment, that safe environment is around you, I think you can contribute much better your perspectives and opinions. That's, I guess, the culture that is there, and that will benefit the organization in a way that you'll just get more diverse perspectives. You'll get input, you'll solve problems differently, you'll find more innovative solutions. And I think for me, if leading a team, I think that's the culture I would want to create, because that's how I can make sure that my team, I hear the different voices, I hear their perspectives, I can help them personally realize their potential by just letting them be who they are. And otherwise, there's research on this that says if you have to constantly hide part of your identity, it takes a lot of energy, right? You'll step into an organization and like, oh, I don't want to talk about, my family at home, or perhaps my religion or my sexual orientation. You constantly have to check on what you're saying. And that energy is so draining, and that energy can be put into your work, or, it can just help you be much more productive. I think that's why inclusion and a safe environment is so important for an individual. And kind of to the point of the skills I've learned, I think for me, the skills I learned very early on, as a child growing up across cultures, is curiosity. So you kind of just, when you go to another country, you're kind of like, oh, I'm curious. Like, how come they do it in this way? I'm used to doing it in that way. I mean, a bit more of a funny example, but it just struck me early on in the US. I remember, asking someone, or someone in the street actually asking me, how are you? And in Germany, a normal response would be, I'll tell you my life. If someone asks me, how are you? I take it serious. I'm going to tell you how I'm feeling. And, as a young child, I would just kind of pour out my heart. And the person was at the other end of the street when I finished my first sentence. And my first instant thought was, oh, how superficial. They don't even want to know about me. Why are they then even asking it? Without realizing that, how are you in the US is almost like, just saying hi. It's a way of just, initial conversation. But it just, those small little things, you have to understand the differences, because otherwise you make assumptions and you can quickly judge someone just based on what you think should be the right behavior. So early on, I realized that. And I think the other thing which which I, as a child, always remember playing with, one of my American neighbors, and we neither spoke each other's languages. But as children, that didn't matter. She would point at an airplane and tell me the English word for it. I would point at it and tell her the German word. Or we'd look at kind of, cartoon books and try to explain to each other what we're going to do. So that simplicity of connecting with someone without language, just being curious about each other. I think curiosity, I think, is a key skill. And then really trying to not judge someone based on their behavior, but rather saying, okay, I'm curious to know how come you did it in this way, or what's your thinking behind it. And I think that has helped me at work as well, to just not assume I know what someone is thinking or where they're coming from, but to ask a few more questions. And in that way, kind of then come to a better solution in the end.
It's a very interesting point, actually, you're making. And I love the story and the image with the two children who don't speak the same language, because I think our words carry so much when we communicate with others, that actually that example of not having the words to be able to express something actually removes a number of possible judgments and assumptions that, as you said, we need to stay away from. And I think I agree with you here as well. One of the things I love, and you have you've done some coaching as well, like me, so you've probably heard about it, but I love the way to phrase it, where it's not about removing that judgment, because I think all of us have some of that judgment from our experiences, and sometimes it's a good thing possibly as well, but it's about releasing that judgment. It's about consciously saying, yeah, it seems like I'm going into an area of judgment, but how am I going to put it in a box on the side for now? Because that will impair my way of being able to be curious and be vulnerable, and to see what the other person has to bring. So thank you so much for that story and sharing that. And so if we now jump a little bit on the work side, and I'm sure you've seen that as well, that trend happening. We always talked about diversity and equity and inclusion, but more and more actually there's the word belonging coming as well, which is being added to all these concepts. And I think that's a key word, I think, that comes up here. Why is belonging important in the organization?
I love the saying, and I'm sure you might have heard of it. Diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. And then I think now adding on belonging is you dance like no one is watching. You can just fully be yourself and you're part of the party. So I think belonging is such a fascinating concept, because from a psychological perspective, we actually all have a deep need to belong. And, interestingly enough, for me, after living for about 10 years in the US, I decided to go back to study in Germany. And I came back to Germany kind of thinking, well, I'm German, right? I'll fit in, I'll go to university. And I came back and I really struggled to identify with a lot of the other students, or I just felt like I didn't belong. I didn't have the same experiences growing up. I had no idea about the German kind of politics at that time, or the pop culture. And also when you're in conversation, you're just missing certain elements. So that's the first time where I really thought about the concept of belonging. And does my identity have to be connected to a nationality? Because that's, I think, how I try, in the US, every time someone would ask me, I'd say, I'm German. Of course I'm German. And when you're kind of outside of your country, you hold that very strongly. And so that was when I really kind of rethought about myself and identity. And I think belonging and identity are so deeply linked. It's kind of what do you identify with? And for me, at least at that time, I had to really rethink and think, well, actually, I don't feel I need to belong to one national culture, but I can belong to different ways of being or thinking, or, to a global community. And I think similar at work, it's kind of, it's a feeling that actually someone has. So that's why probably belonging is also much more harder to quantify, to put metrics against and things like that. But it's, if I step into this organization, do I feel like I can belong? Can I be myself? But do I also, I guess, see an environment where I see myself represented in leadership, in, the way people are being and how they're connecting? Or is it very kind of groupy, and is it just only kind of one way of being that doesn't, where I don't feel like I belong? I think that's why belonging is so powerful, because it's actually based on our human need of deeply kind of feeling a connection with wherever we are.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, and one of the points you made, which I really like as well, and links a little bit to some of the things we were talking about before, is the fact that belonging, and I think you described it very well, is it's always something that I decide whether I belong or not. I can, so if you and I were working together, I can say I'm maybe a diverse person because I have a friend and a colleague who is from Germany, the US, wherever. I can easily quantify it. But one thing I cannot do is to decide whether there is not even a way to say where I make you belong somehow. It's for you to decide actually whether you belong or not. And linked to what we discussed before, I think the only thing I can do is to be curious enough to understand whether I have done the right things for you to be able to belong or not. But the decision at the end of the day is in your hands. And that's where the identity, I think, is a beautiful way to phrase it, because we tend to forget actually that it's not because we do all these things to become more diverse and more inclusive and bring equity and equality to our teams, to our surroundings, that actually we create that belonging as well, always. So,
and it's interesting what you're saying, and I guess there's two sides to it, because I think yes, there's an individual, how do I feel about belonging, which I think is critical to it, and then there, I guess, is the organizational culture, or the elements we put in that make sure we create a culture where people can feel like they belong. It's kind of, because I think sometimes it's hard to say, well, it's up to you. You just kind of act, yourself and feel like you belong. And sometimes it's in all these small little things in organizations, like when you, when there are different religious festivals, is that actually considered when you're doing your team meetings? Or, how considerate are you of different time zones when you're working globally? Yeah. Or your systems, how are they really enabling someone from a different gender identity to put themselves within the system, or is it female, male? Those little small things are indications of, do I feel a sense of belonging? Do I see myself within the organization and the culture? So yeah, I think it's kind of an interconnected element of bringing in the diversity, then having that inclusion element, and then I can feel a sense of belonging.
No, completely. And it's a good jump here we're making actually, because we can start talking maybe a little bit more about actions and what can be done. And maybe let's start with at an individual level actually. So I'm part of your organization, and you are the only German, or you're the only woman in the team. And sometimes I feel it can be difficult for people to maybe know what to do, and quite often also maybe not what not to do. But if from where you stand on the cultural side, what can I do to be more culturally inclusive?
Great question. Yeah, I think for me, it's always about asking and showing again that curiosity. Because, similar to my story, I think many would have similar stories. Whilst I'm German, I'm probably, many of my friends, I'm probably the least German they kind of know. because of my upbringing and I guess my way of being. But I think that's also sometimes tricky, right? Well, I think cultural awareness is critical. And I think there's an element of thinking of culture almost like an onion, so kind of just understanding the outer layer. What are some of the stereotypes we have about another culture is really important, because we all have stereotypes there, through media or through own experiences and ways of being. We have them, and kind of just being really aware of them. And then going a little bit deeper on, okay, there are different ways of being across cultures, which is helpful. And then there's the individual in the middle. So I think when you have people from different cultures working in your team, it's really kind of connecting with them and understanding, what's really important to you. And are there, festivals, it could be even connecting on festivals, or are there certain holidays that are really important to you that should I be aware of, or is there a certain work style that's important to you? And I think the more we can just connect individually and be curious about each other, I think it helps. And once we build a trusting relationship, then I can also say, hey, Julian, that I didn't feel was really, that kind of went against, I don't like this kind of conversation, or in my culture, that's not really what we talk about. I think that's kind of, if you can connect and build a trusting relationship, it's much easier to work across cultures.
You actually, but you saying that reminded me of a very, very good example. So a friend of mine from a very different culture, actually, lady, and I did my, clearly as well, I mean, being very vulnerable here, I did something that was very culturally not right. By being French, I met her the first time, and I went and kissed, because that's what we do, French people. We just kiss everyone. It's that's especially friends. Actually, we don't do that always in the work environment, but or friends of friends. This is a natural thing to do, and it's interesting the way you said it, because it took her 1 year actually because she didn't want to upset me and to make me feel bad. It took her 1 year to say, you know what, we don't really do that in my culture. It's not normal, or it's not it's not normal, but it's not a common thing to do, and it's not always appreciated. And I'm like, I blocked at that point in time, because I've been across many cultures, but this is something that didn't even cross my mind at the time. And you're right, actually, that element of kind of psychological safety and trust and creating that bond and that relationship becomes very important here, because it's a both way thing. Then she feels safe to be able to say, let's not do that anymore, because it's not really the right thing for me. It doesn't work for me. And I'm like, and I completely understood. Of course, I was not upset about it, but it took that time for that person to feel safe, and also be very vulnerable on her side to be able to say, I need to speak up.
Yeah. And I think it's such an important point as well, what you're saying, Julian, around, I always take this example of, like, if you're standing on my foot and I don't tell you you're standing on my foot, you might not notice, right? Like, it's kind of like, if we also don't share that I'm hurting or that's not quite right, the other person might also not know. It is kind of, I think, a two-sided thing. We as individuals have to be somewhat conscious and aware that our actions or perhaps different ways of being is not always appreciated or might have different implications. And there's to a certain extent, you can create, you can inform yourself, you can be really sensitive, but you can never know, because some people will have different sensitivities or understandings. I think there's that second element of, actually, I have to speak up if something isn't quite right for me. And the more you have that environment that's safe and that open space, and as you were saying, if you can be vulnerable yourself, that always helps in opening up for others as well.
And for sure, I mean, the great thing as well with that, the example, at least for me, is that we probably have a deeper bond now as well, and a deeper relationship, because, well, obviously after this happened, I hugely apologized for stepping in the wrong direction. And yeah, because I don't always know everything, and I am also in a learning process, and she understood that, and I think we can have discussions that are very different. She knows that she can have those kind of conversations with me, and I can also be more open in asking other questions, because that first example came, and then now I can actually dig deeper and understand better her culture as well in that way. So,
and you know what? It just reminds me of, sometimes you're going to be in friendships or in relationships with people where you can develop deeper connections, and they can almost be your cultural ambassadors in many ways as well. And sometimes you're going to be in a cultural environment where you're just going to instantly connect with someone, but you don't have a chance to deeper connect. And I always remember this example on, so as I mentioned, I got married to an Indian man, and we had actually a wedding in Germany, in the UK, and in India. So it was all about, culturally really embracing our different sides. But when we got married in India, there was a tradition at home that, you would serve food to all your guests. So as kind of new bride and groom, we would walk around and serve to our guests. And, from a German mindset, I would go around and I would ask, would you like some more food? And they'd be like, no. I was like, okay, let me move on, right? And serve more food. And so I would do the rounds. At some point, my husband, at that time just came behind me. Annie, you need to ask like multiple times. They think you're really rude, you're not offering them enough food. But I've asked, and they said no, and I respect their no. But it was just something where, right, the culture was so different, and I wasn't aware of that, and I didn't have time to connect with all of them deeply, and build that relationship. So it was really helpful that I got that culture insight and saying, this is how your behavior is perceived, because in the Indian culture, people will, it's almost like you offer many, many times, and then at some point they'll just say yes to the food. So that's kind of a very polite way and respectful way. And so I think it's really helpful as well, bringing that back to the work culture, kind of have some cultural ambassadors. So if you've built some really deep connections with some people, to kind of saying, okay, I'm going to be working with some Indian colleagues. Can you just help me understand a little bit what's important? Again, not to stereotype. And I think it's still always important to try to connect with the human. But there are certain ways where, just certain ways of being are culturally defined. And I think it is helpful to have that to navigate across cultures.
It's a very interesting point here. And I was wondering, in your opinion, for organizations that are kind of starting on that journey of developing more diversity and inclusion and equity in their workplace, what can HR and leaders do to kind of activate those allies and ambassadors across the organization?
I think, sometimes in this diversity, equity, and inclusion space, I think sometimes it can be very much, it's for a minority group of people, right? We're just going to look at the underrepresented groups and underprivileged and see how to support, which is an absolutely critical element, because we're trying to create equitable opportunities for all and equitable workplaces. So we do have to look at, certain groups which over time have been marginalized, and how do we create a more equal system. But I think one thing to just shift in the mindset of organizations and leaders is that actually inclusion and belonging, having a culture of inclusion and belonging, will make the workplace better for everyone. If you're a white male, like you, Julian, right, you're incredibly diverse. It doesn't mean all white men are the same, right? And sometimes I think that's where we miss out in connecting with our individual diversity. We all have different lived experiences, different backgrounds, different beliefs, different ways of being, different sexual orientations, and so on. And I think it's, for one, just appreciating that diversity within us, and also understanding it for ourselves. and then appreciating everyone else's diversity. And secondly, I think it's also thinking about intersectionality. That's another word that gets thrown around a lot in our space. But just very simply, intersectionality is also thinking about, I can be a woman, a gay woman, I can be a Black gay woman. And that intersectionality means I'm not just one identity, and I'm probably not even just those three identities, but because I'm part of those three, there will be certain elements that might hinder me even further from progressing, because there are lots of stereotypes or systemic discriminations against certain elements of those groups. So I think that awareness is really helpful. And then we have a concept in PCS which we call ally of diversity. So how can pretty much anyone step into the space of being an ally of diversity? And that means, one, understanding yourself as diverse, and then secondly, others, but then also really stepping forward for people who are distinctly different from you. And saying, okay, let me more deeply understand that community. And I personally think employee resource groups or employee networks are such powerful ways in organizations to create change makers, to enable diverse groups to share their voices, and those voices being kind of amplified and heard. So if you're in a leadership position, I would always recommend, see if you can be an executive sponsor for any of the employee networks. Can you just be part of them? Can you be part of meetings? Because it will just open your eyes and your ears to kind of, what are those important issues for them. And then I think it's, again, being really conscious on how you lead your team and your own behaviors. Because as a leader, you'll be a role model, right? So are you using inclusive language? Are you creating a space where, people will have a voice, that voice is heard? Are you constantly checking in on your biases? And I do think it's really helpful to have coaching, to have, reverse mentoring with people who are really different from you, to do training, because all of that will continuously make sure you have a mindset that is actually open for diversity and inclusion. I think some of those are the actions you can take.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for sharing that. It's been wonderful talking to you, and I think we could be here for a very, very long time. But I wanted to ask you maybe a last question that I tend to ask most people usually jumping in. What's your words of wisdom that you want to leave us with?
Oh, such a hard question at the end. Words of wisdom. I think, sometimes it sounds so simple, but I really think if we could shift more to really deeply and actively listen to ourselves and to others, we can connect much more deeply with ourselves and others. And I think that connection, that human connection, is something that will take us forward. I think I feel like the pandemic has really, it's like Mother Nature telling us something, it's like, go to your room, sit there and think about what you've done to the nature, what we've done to our climate, to the nature, how we've been engaging and interacting with each other. And there seems to be lots more coming, right, with all the things which are happening right now. So I think there's so much for us to learn. And I almost feel like we should be just listening in more internally, and listening more to others without that judgment that we were talking about, or at least just, let's just set that aside and let me just listen to who you are, who are you? Not, sometimes we get also so caught up in the words and the language and opinions and perspectives, but I want to just connect humanly with you. And I think that's beautiful. When we can create more human connections, I think we can actually create a better world for all of us.
Beautiful end of our conversation. Thank you so much for that. Last thing I'd like to ask you is if anyone would like to hear more about you or reach out, if they have questions or they want to connect with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yes, I'd love that. Love to hear from any of you. I think LinkedIn is the best platform. I try to share and write things on LinkedIn, so you can find me under Jennifer Stanzl. So feel free to connect with me there.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that. And I'll put the link in the notes as well of to your profile. So
Brilliant.
Again, thank you so much for being here with me today. It was a pleasure to have you. I hope we'll have you again in the near future. Maybe we'll talk deeper on some of these topics. Thanks
you
so much, Jenny.
Oh, thank you so much, Julian. Wonderful to be part of this.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others. Post about it on social media or leave a rating and review. We'd love to hear from you. To catch all the latest from us, you can follow us on Instagram, Facebook or YouTube at As Diverse as Two Peas in a Pod. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.